Hi, and welcome to this episode or lesson of Learning with Power. And I'm Scott Powers Houston, and so welcome to the lesson. Alright, so in this lesson we're going to be talking about the impact or the details of the Shohei Ohtani deal that he recently signed with the Los Angeles Dodgers this past month. And we're going to use that as like an introduction, basic introduction to the basic concepts of what is communism and why that ultimately did not work. Okay, and wouldn't work, not in today's society. Okay, so let's talk about Shohei Ohtani's deal first, because it seems to be all the rage. It's all over the internet. It's gone viral. Everybody's talking about it. And okay, so there's basically three different reasons why it angers people. First of all, for baseball fans, you've got most fans are angry about the deal mainly because they're just pissed that their team didn't sign them. You know, why the Dodgers? Why is it always these big fat cats that sign these guys? You know, my team, you know, if you're a Brewers fan, my team could never spend $700 million on a player, you know, but if you sure would like to have them. So that's the one argument. And that's not really a good argument. It is part of the problem is the disparity in baseball between the haves and the have-nots, but that's kind of the world, and it's hard to do anything about that with the blessings of the haves, you know, because the only way to do anything about that is, again, then this is how it gets into communism, is it has to be with the blessing of the haves. And so for the have-nots to rise up, the money has to be shared more evenly, is what has to ultimately happen. Okay. Secondly, the reason why people are upset is they think it's a major tax dodge by the Dodgers. And as far as their CBT, the collective bargaining tax, and whether they have to pay penalties or not. And basically, it is. It's a major tax dodge. And, I mean, you know, I guess they don't call them the Dodgers for nothing, you know. So, they got away with it. And I've tried to ask, and we'll talk about some more details about it, and I've tried to ask MLBTradeRumors.com several different times in several different ways to give more clarification on exactly how this deferred money is going to be paid out and how that affects the tax. And they seem to refuse to answer me. Either they don't know and they're embarrassed, or they just are shining me. But anyway, the reason why it's only a $46 million hit that the Dodgers take on the tax threshold is because basically the Players Association, or MLB, only values the $680 million that's deferred as being worth $44 million in today's money. And so for 2024, the tax bill will be like $46 million. So the $2 million that he's actually collecting in salary, plus the 44 that is today's equivalent for the 68 that he's going to be deferred. But he's going to be deferred $680 million. Okay, so they won't tell me how the tax is going to be affected later in the deal. So I mean, I understand the concept for 2024 and why it's only a $46 million hit, but it's over the next 10 years he gets $2 million a year, and then 680 of his contract is deferred till 2034 until 2043. Now, if you're going to defer $680 million, I mean, why not make it for 20 more years or even 30 more years? You know, why does it have to stop when he's 48? You know, I mean, they could defer it for, let's say, 15 more years until he's like 63. You know, and then it'd be like 25 years of deferred payments. Then your $680 million is deferred even more. But as it is, you know, the Dodgers for 10 years between 2034 and 2043, and this is already how it is without any more additions or subtractions to the team at all until you get to 2034, they're going to have to lay out in real payroll, you know, $68 million every year for Ohtani, who may not even be playing for them anymore, plus $11 million for bets that they are already committed to, and there's even some money for Freeman too. So that's going to be $80 million a year in real money that they're going to have to pay. That it doesn't count toward the tax apparently, but it's still money that they're going to have to somehow pay. And if they have a problem with their streaming or cable or whatever, or something like that, if there's any problem with their revenue stream, then that could be difficult. But I think that they're anticipating that having Ohtani on the team is going to be a huge boost to their revenue stream because of all of the attention that he draws from people in Japan, for example, who are huge consumers and buy a lot of Dodgers stuff. So that's why the Dodgers think it's a worthwhile deal. And Ohtani was willing to just take $2 million of his salary each year, which is like nothing. I mean, it's a backup catcher makes more than that. I mean, that's nothing. And the reason why he was willing to defer so much of his money is because he wants the Dodgers to be able to avoid the tax hit so that they can have a competitive team. And by the Dodgers avoiding the tax hit, so if they go over the penalties, they could pay like a 2/3 penalty on the salary. So if they're $40 million over the penalty, they have to pay an additional like $32 million in real money as like a fine. So when they sign somebody to $40 over the, and so when they're at their luxury threshold and they sign somebody to another $40 million contract, it's really a $70 million contract because that's how much real money they have to pay in order to facilitate that. So that's a lot of money each and every year of penalties, and so better to defer that and have that, you know, reduce the penalties. So it's a major tax dodge. It's a major tax dodge. And the money that they're saving by deferring it like that, by not having to pay the penalties that they would normally have to pay in order to sign them, is a huge dodge, and there is no way around it. Now, what people don't answer, and what I want to know is, so if that's calculated as only worth $44 million and $68 million is only worth $44 million in today's money, shouldn't that then go up in each subsequent year? I mean, is the total tax hit going to be $460 million, or is it going to be more than that? Because the salary that they're going to have to pay in 2033 should not, or the tax hit in 2033 should not just be $44 million, because the deferred payments are going to start the next year. So, you know, well, in today's money, 2033, money in 2034, $68 million is only worth $44 million. No, it should be worth like $64 million or something like that, you know, much closer to the total amount. So, you know, and if it's not done that way because of the verbiage in the CBT, that's the collective bargaining, not the CBT, the CBA, that's the collective bargaining agreement that they signed a year and a half ago. It should be. Then that's a problem. That's a major flaw, because, and it's not that everybody that signs a big contract from here on out is going to do major deferrals in order to help their team, but, you know, it could be, you know, instead of signing, because, you know, as salaries are now $400 or $500 million, you know, I think you'll see it more often. It's not going to be at the extent that Ohtani is. You know, Ohtani is a little bit of an unusual situation because he does make so much money off the field. So he's able to just accept $2 million as a salary for next year and take $68 million deferred, because he makes over $50 million in endorsements in Japan. Now, in a way, that makes him a very busy person, because not only does he have to spend all day training to be as good a hitter as he can be and to be as good an athlete as he can be, but he has to spend all day also training to make sure he's a good pitcher whenever he starts pitching again in 2025. And another, if he earns that much in endorsements, it's almost a full-time job making all those commercials. I mean, to actually get the endorsements, you have to actually, pose with the box of Wheaties, or do some kind of a radio commercial or some kind of, you have to actually do those commercials. It doesn't really take a lot of time, but I mean, it's a couple of hours, to sit down and to do it. And I know, because I used to make commercials. So it's like another job. So I don't know how he's going to find time to do all that stuff, but I guess he's works it out somehow. All right, so that's how the deal actually is structured. And so then, for people who are not baseball fans, they are very, very angry over the idea of Shohei Ohtani getting basically $70 million a year to play a game, to hit a ball with a bat and to throw a ball. That seems a little bit excessive amount of money to pay for a guy just to play baseball when there are people in the world who are starving. And even if they're not starving, they're struggling, to make ends meet. And it's bad timing too, because in America, times seem to be getting tougher. And rents are very high. Salaries have gone up, but still food prices have gone up. So the cost of living, it's hard for people to make ends meet now. More so than it was, let's say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Maybe not as bad as it was in 2009, of course, or 2010. But times are getting hard. And so, and this is why a lot of people are pushing back on Biden, even Democrats, just because they feel the pinch. And so you've got all these people who are saying, look, we're struggling to make ends meet, and this guy's making $70 million to play a game. It's ridiculous use of funds. And that brings us to the introduction of communism. Okay, so basically that concept is communism. That's what communism is. That was the answer that communism was for those types of questions. When you say that's a ridiculous allocation of funds, meaning conceptually that those funds come out of like a general pot of money that there is available in the world, and $70 million is being allocated for one guy to play baseball when it could be allocated to scholarships and helping people who are in distress. And that's communism. That's exactly what communism is. That's the whole concept of communism. Is basically you take all the greater resources and you dole them out where they are most needed. And so if Major League Baseball or even the government were to step in and say, well, as a baseball player, you should not make any more than $1 million a year. And as a baseball owner, you should not make any more than $5 million a year. And if they did that, first of all, you'd have a lot less people trying to play baseball. And a lot less people interested in owning any teams, because then it would be hard for them to get by as well. So, because there's so many dynamics to owning a team, suddenly you can, if you're only making $5 million profit, a $20 million hit on your television coverage, puts you out of business. So it's hard to run a business on the margins that way. So that kind of a business, but that concept, that idea, is the foundation of what communism is, and what it was proposed to be when it was first introduced. And now people always credit Karl Marx as being the founder of communism. He wasn't actually. I mean, the concept existed conceptually long before he came around, but he became a very vocal proponent of it and wrote books, Das Kapital, basically promoting communism. And a lot of people, unfortunately, villainize Karl Marx and say that he's responsible for Soviet communism, and that's, you have Soviet communism and then regular communism. Regular communism is okay, but Soviet communism is not. And Soviet communism is all about Karl Marx. No. First of all, Karl Marx is a German, and he had nothing to do with Lenin or the Bolshevik Revolution or any of those things. And actually, a lot of the things that Karl Marx is quoted as supporting or saying are just not true. It's not what he said at all. And I find that all of the conservative people that attack Karl Marx, I asked them, have you read Das Kapital? Have you actually read Karl Marx? And the answer is no, they haven't. They've got lots to say about him, but they haven't actually read anything that he wrote. So I'm like, well, how do you really know? I mean, so what they're doing is they're accepting the explanation and the canned presentation for what he said and what he stood for that's being presented to them by their chosen leaders, by the people that control the media. And then the people in the media, they are either on the left or on the right, and people on the right say, Karl Marx said this, and so those are the people on the right, that's their chosen leader, and they accept what they say Karl Marx said. And this is essentially, because they can't read the whole book, on the air, but essentially this is what he was saying, and these are the things that he stood for. And people just accept it very blindly. And I don't think that and for some reason they don't seem to have a problem with accepting, even when I point that out. And I'm like, you're just blindly accepting what your leaders have told you that he has said, rather than really researching it for yourself. You don't see that as a problem, that you're just blindly following your leader and you're just going with whatever he tells you. This is what he said. Oh, okay, yeah, that's right. We're just going to blindly follow. You don't see that as being a problem, and it is a problem. I mean, that's how we got Nazis. Literally, So, but anyway, but the foundation for it. So, and actually, Soviet communism wasn't at all real communism, and real communism has never really been done or tried, and it will never be done again. The closest true communism ever came was actually under Pol Pot in Cambodia in the 1970s. That was pure communism, as much as he could make it pure communism. And that's, of course, the killing fields. And he made you basically work until you dropped, and then when you dropped, you died. And so the concept is basically, this is why these concepts are antiquated. And they all come out of the 19th century. And it's because in the 19th century, you still had a lot of people starving and struggling to eat every day. It was still a big thing to just get food every day. And that was the human condition for millions of years. And as starting in like the Middle Ages, it started to get a little better. But basically in the 19th century, it was still difficult for a very large percentage of the population just to be able to eat every day. And the measure of wealth was like how fat you were. Even in the 1830s, painters would paint people as being a little bit more cherubic than they really were, just to make them look rich, to make them look wealthy. Because if you were a little bit fat, that meant you had to be rich, because you can afford more food than you even need. That's how rich you are. Now, food is such a minor part of people's budgets. You're not rich because you're fat. A fat person is not regarded as, oh, he must be rich. Not in today's standards. But in the 19th century, it still was important to eat. And most animals, even evolved animals, even our best friends, cats and dogs, spend most all of their waking hours trying to acquire food in some way. That's their obsession. All day long they are trying to acquire food, and they're thinking about, how can I get more food? And that's all they're thinking about. Because that's how they've been evolved, because that's how they continue their species, is to make sure that they eat and survive. And these are all, and so Adam Smith and Karl Marx and Lenin and Ayn Rand and all these people that have come up with these concepts, these government concepts, and wrote these books, or even had these movies or whatever made, like Atlas Shrugged, they're all antiquated. They're all based on a society that was, that we're talking about 19th century society. And so, you know, when Lenin in 1918, actually the Bolshevik Revolution was 1917, and so in 1918 Lenin takes over, and now the Soviet Union is formed, and communism is introduced as a government structure, and basically the proletariat, and they were against anybody that was a capitalist. It was like anti-capitalism was basically what communism evolved as. Now, we will learn in later lectures that communism is not socialism, which everybody on the right seems to get that confused. Just the S word, socialism, they think is the same as communism. It is not at all. So, but we'll learn that later on. But anyway, and that's just, again, more ignorance. And more of a false narrative that people in this country, they just follow these false narratives. It's unbelievable to me, actually, how people's minds are just so controlled by totally false narratives. Anyway, that's America, that's the media, and that's people, I guess. So, okay, so the concept of communism and production and things like that, you know, that to have everything be controlled by the government so that there's enough to go around. And that concept came around in the 19th century because basically it was an answer to basically monarchies and Marie Antoinette and Louis XIV and things like that. They were opulent in their wastefulness and in their consumption and in their riches, you know. You know, Marie Antoinette, you know, she had all these different maids and different people doing her, and people fluffing, and, you know, and ever since Roman times, you know, Roman emperors lived in the same way. And, you know, meanwhile you've got, you know, 80–90% of the population starving. And for them, they really hated, eventually, as they got more exposure and they saw more of what, like, Marie Antoinette was doing, they began to really hate those people. And that was understandable. And so then the answer was, you know, look, if you just spread the wealth around, then nobody has to starve. You know, Marie Antoinette doesn't need 14, you know, chambermaids and to have her hair fluffed every 5 minutes. You know, it's not necessary. Although these things still happen, you know. I mean, if you've ever been on a movie set with John Travolta, they are priming him between every single shot. He's got like 3 people that dote upon him between every single shot. They're like his people he is the most excessive guy that you could possibly imagine. And it's today. So, I mean, he's the modern day of Marie Antoinette, basically. But today it's a lot more acceptable now, and it's a lot more common now. A lot more people live that way now than there used to be. It used to be, you know, 1 or 2 people live that way. So, the idea of communism is, okay, well, providing enough food and, you know, health care and basic things, you know, that's all anybody needs. And in 1918, when communism became the government in Russia, we already had some modern technology at that time. We already had made some advancements, but not like we have today. And so, you know, it was viewed as, okay, as not everybody needs to have a car, as long as there is ample transportation, you know, public transportation, as long as, and especially in Russia, as long as everybody has enough heat, and as long as everybody has enough food, and, you know, maybe a ration of vodka, you got to allow them to have their vodka, and things like that, and enough clothes, you know, enough clothing, and means to be able to keep those clothes clean or whatever, and that's all anybody needs. And that concept is fine. And that's basically the concept that a lot of people even today have when they complain about Shohei Ohtani. They say, why does he need $70 million to play baseball? All we need is just the basic necessities. If you just spread wealth around, then everybody can have what they need. And that really was Soviet communism. That's basically what it was. And it started out fine, actually. Unfortunately, even with that kind of a government, you wound up with a dictator. And the reason why that happened is because of the flaws of basic communism. And the biggest flaw with communism, and this is why it relates to the Ohtani deal, is Okay, so you go back to like Pol Pot's communism, like in Cambodia in the 1970s. Everybody had to work in a field. And so you've got, and that was the preoccupation of Pol Pot, was to make sure that enough rice and food was produced in the fields, okay? And he wanted everybody to work in the fields and produce food. And they spent all day doing that. And in the 19th century or the 18th century, you know, that might have been okay. But what happened is, and so communism started, but the problem with communism is what happens is when, okay, everybody's working in the field, not everybody is physically capable of producing the same as everybody else. There's gonna be invariably one guy or a woman perhaps who is just able to produce more. You know, I mean, there was a woman actually in a particular plantation, there's a story about her. She was just very fast, and she just had a knack for it. She could pick cotton faster than any other slave. She was worth double any other slave because, you know, most slaves could, if they could pick two barrels or bushels of hay, you know, in a day, she could pick 4 or 5. She was double the best of what anybody else could do. And that's normal. I mean, you're going to have that. I mean, in any kind of a commune type of situation, you're going to have one particular producer who's going to literally double anybody else's production. And that seems to be the ratio all the time, as everybody else goes up to this limit, but there's one guy who can do double that amount. And that was me in sales for a while, when I cared about it. And everybody hated me, and I didn't care. Anyway, so that's another story. But so what happens when that guy or a woman who produces double of what anybody else can produce? What happens if they say, you know what, I really worked hard today, I'm a little bit hungry, can I have an extra ration of food? And that seems very reasonable, and most people are like, yeah, sure, you know, yeah, you worked hard, yeah, sure, here's another ration of food for you. And then what happens if they want more than that? You know, if they say, you know, why do I only get 1 blanket at night? It's kind of cold. Can I have 2 blankets? You know, can I have an extra pair of shoes? You know, can I have better shoes? These shoes are like, look, my hands are getting, can I have better quality gloves than what everybody else has got? And that starts the problem. What happens when somebody wants more? Even if it's totally rational and justifiable and reasonable to ask for more, this is what throws the whole thing out of balance. Because eventually you have one person who's getting more. And people then get jealous. So why does that person get so much? You know, and then when not only does that happen, but now somebody also has to decide now who gets what. So if we're going to be given more to this person because they produce more, how about that person? They produce pretty good, you know, like still the most, you know, not as much as the top, but still the most. Should they also get more? And who is responsible and who makes the decisions for allocating all of, you know, the wealth that you have, the collective food and the collective blankets and clothes and all that you've been able to put together? Who allocates or decides who gets what? So ultimately you have to have a boss or some kind of a political structure or system that allocates who gets what. And then if you need resources, you know, if you need more fertilizer for your crops, if you don't make fertilizer yourself, you might have to trade with a neighboring commune. And so if you trade with a neighboring commune, who conducts this transaction? Who makes this deal? Who decides what a fair amount of resources to pay is going to be equitable for the fertilizer that we're getting from this other commune? And eventually, so you still have to have leadership, and you still have to have an uneven and an unequal allocation of resources and funds, and that's what invariably happens. And so in 1918, if the Soviet Union, when it first started, if the world did not change after 1918, if it never evolved or changed beyond that, it would have been probably okay. But you can't hold back technology, and you can't hold back the advancement of people. And so what happened is you had advancements. Cars got better, planes, music, entertainment, sports, television, movies. These things all came to be. And so you've got very, very productive, very, very important Russians saying, gee, the Americans have this thing called television. It's pretty nice. And you know what? Now that we're doing so well, we've got improved farming techniques, we've got improved this and improved that. We don't actually have to work all day anymore. We don't have to spend 14 hours a day working. We can get everything done if everybody just works 8 hours a day. So now we're going to have 8 hours a day of free time, when we're not sleeping and we're not working. Now what do we do during that time? Well, we eat, we take a shower, whatever. But what else do we do? How do we need to entertain ourselves somehow, so entertainment emerged as a thing. Really, that's a phenomenon of the 20th century. I started in the 19th century, had operas and things like that, but really was a big phenomenon in the 20th century was entertainment and then access to entertainment. And so then the Soviet Union has their own hockey team, the Red Army, and now we're going to have to give access to the people, so we're going to televise the Red Army's hockey games. And so who does that? And how do you pay for that? And how do you pay for the players? And so now that generated income. People wanted to watch it. And so people are watching the program. And so an advertiser comes in and says, you know what, we really need to sell more wickets, and we're contributing a lot to the government, but we need to sell more wickets. So can you spend maybe 30 seconds on one of your broadcasts of a hockey team to just talk about our product and try to get people interested in buying more of our product? And very reasonable requests. We are producing more. We make the most popular vodka in all of Russia. We are paying more than our share of funds to the government in order to keep this whole thing going. What if they want more? What if they go to the advertisers or to the producers of the TV show and they say, we want to put in a little advertising? Would that be fair? And it is fair. What's perfectly fair for them to ask for that. But now you've got the same problem. The fundamental problem of communism is what happens when somebody wants more. What happens when somebody deserves more? What happens when one hockey player is so good he scores goals in every game, and he scores 40 goals in a season when the most anybody else can score is 20, and he says, you know what, I want a little bit better apartment than everybody else has. I think I deserve it. Why should I live in the same crappy little crummy little apartment that barely has enough light and barely has enough heat that everybody else lives in, when I'm producing more? Very reasonable. Okay, you get to have a better apartment. And so now you have to build a new apartment complex, and all the people there are rich people. And so that messes up communism, because you still have rich people. You still can't get around it. You still can't avoid it. And like I said, if you could hold back prosperity, if everything stayed the same as it was in the 19th century, then communism would work. But the problem is what happens when somebody wants more, and you don't need to work every day, and now entertainment becomes a thing, and now you've got movies, and you've got sports, and you've got television, and now we have the internet. And so that brings us back to Shohei Ohtani. Why should Shohei Ohtani get $70 million a year? Well, first of all, he is the best baseball player that there is. And not only is he probably the most valuable baseball player today, but he's probably the most valuable baseball player since Babe Ruth. People say he's the best of all time. I argue against that. I say Babe Ruth was the greatest of all time still. But, you can make an argument for it. And it doesn't matter whether he's better or not. He's as good as Babe Ruth. He's as valuable as Babe Ruth. And you gotta look at him as the Babe Ruth of today. And that's perfectly valid analysis of Ohtani. Now, Babe Ruth is another story. So, you know, back in 1910, baseball players did not make a lot of money because they were just playing a stupid game. But they liked to play the game, and so they would prefer to play baseball if they could make any kind of professional money at all and survive. They'd rather play baseball than driving a truck or something like that. And their parents a lot of times would be very disappointed. They're like, I thought you were going to go to college and study to be an attorney. What are you playing baseball for? This is a disgrace to the family. Get a real job, you know. And a lot of the boo birds in the audience would yell at the players and get a real job, you bum, you know. And Brooklyn, they were called the bums, you know, because they weren't really working, you know, they were just playing baseball all day, you know, they were playing all day, right? And so then it comes along, and so then along comes this fella named Babe Ruth. Again, same problem. He was worth double of what any other player could do. The home runs that he could hit and the fact that he could also pitch was double the production. He was worth at least 2 of any other, even the best player, he was worth double. And so Babe Ruth says one year to the owners of the Yankees, he says, you know what, I want $100,000. And they were like, what? $100,000? Because that was a lot of money in the 1920s. That was a lot of money. What? $100,000 to play friggin' baseball? Are you out of your mind? He says, well, yeah, I understand why you feel that way. I just won't play this year then. How about that? I just won't play. Yeah, you're just going to have the Yankees without Babe Ruth. And they were like, oh, I can't do that. Now, the thing is that Babe Ruth knows they have the money. Because as baseball is getting more popular, as entertainment's getting more popular, more people are going to the games, more people, and now they have radio in the 1920s, and people are listening to the games, and there's advertisers on the radio stations, and the radio stations are making money, and the advertisers are making money, and the people's products that are being advertised are making money, and a lot of this money is all going to the owners, and so Babe Ruth knows that they have the money. And basically he says, you're making millions of dollars from this baseball team. You can pay me $100,000. I mean, I produce half of the product. You know, I'm the product. Where would you be without me? And basically they were like, yeah, you're right. Where would we be without you? And around this same time, unions came to evolve. And the unions were like, yeah, look, you guys are making millions of dollars. And you're paying crap wages. You're paying $1 a day or $2 a day to somebody to work in a steel mill. This is not fair. This is a very hard job. And you're making millions of dollars on it. This isn't equitable. We're not going to work. You don't want to pay us a fair wage? Fine, screw you. You make your own steel. Come on down here, Mr. Carnegie, and you make your own steel. Good luck with that. Well, he couldn't. So basically, unions formed. And at first, the pushback, by the owners of these large corporations, there was a standoff, and guns would be drawn. And eventually, Roosevelt had to bring in the army to defend the strikers, that they wouldn't be killed by the mafia that was hired by the owners of the steel mill. And so then we had unions. And so we had Babe Ruth making $100,000 a year to play baseball. And still, baseball grows. And still, the Yankees grow. And still, the popularity grows. Because as Babe Ruth keeps hitting home runs, more people want to come to the games, more people want to listen to the game on the radio, more people want to, and if more people are listening to the game, then the advertisement's worth more, and it is worth more, and the advertisers are making money, and the station's making money, and the people selling widgets are making money, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so this is why Shohei Ohtani makes $700 million. It's because the money is there. For better or for worse, like it or not, whether you think it's fair or not, people happily spend their money. Even people that hardly have any money at all to spend, they can barely eat, they still happily spend their money on cable packages or streaming services or whatever, or baseball caps and jerseys and whatever of Shohei Ohtani or the Dodgers or whatever, and they're going to the games and they're paying $100 for the ticket and going to the games, the money is there. And people, the most watched television program on all cable is the Super Bowl. Every year, the Super Bowl by far gets, and so to advertise on the Super Bowl, it costs a lot of money for a 30-second spot on the Super Bowl because everybody's watching it, because that advertisement's worth a lot of money. It's going to bring you a lot of money if you're advertising. And so the money is there. The money is there. And so the only question is, how should the pie be divided up? And so this is what happened eventually. So the way that the owners dealt with Babe Ruth, for example, and unions in general, was Kenneth Saul Mountain Landis in the 1920s. He instituted what was called the Reserve Clause. Now the reason why he came to power was because of the 1919 debacle, the Black Sox debacle. And so you have people in the White Sox who are working with gangsters to fix and throw the World Series. And they wouldn't have done that if they were making a decent wage. They wouldn't have needed to do that, you know what I mean? They wouldn't have. So, you know, when the guy says, look, we're going to give you $4,000 if you just kind of don't hit so well in the World Series. I mean, it's not hard to do. You just swing, instead of hitting a ball, you just swing and you miss. How does anybody really know? You swing and you miss sometimes anyway. I mean, everybody has hot streaks and slumps naturally. How do they know you're not just having a slump? You know, how does anybody know? So it's enticing. $4,000 was a lot of money in those days. 1919, whew, man, that's like same as my whole yearly salary. Wow. Okay. And so because a few players did that, it made a sensation, and they hired this guy who was tougher than nails to crack down and not allow that anymore, and all these guys were suspended for life, and we're not going to have that anymore. And it's why Pete Rose is suspended even still to this day, and it's still not been reinstated because of gambling. So gambling is out, but also Kenneth Saul Mountain Landis wanted to control these upstart union talking people. Oh my God! So, and there was a legitimate reason for it too. You know, one of the reasons why teams have a fan base is because year after year after year, they have their same core basic players, you know. The Orioles, through their 1966 to 1971 run of all the World Series that they were in and stuff, you know, they had Robinson at third, they had Powell at first, they had Frank Robinson in the outfield, they had, you know, Palmer, and they had Cuellar, and they had McNally, and this was the core of their team. And they still had the same basic, you know, Eddie Watt and Grant Jackson or whatever, Dick Hall. They had the same basic players all throughout that entire era. That's the core. Now, some of the outer skirts, you know, the peripheral players changed, but the core of the team stayed the same, and that really does a lot for fan appreciation of their favorite team. And so the Yankees had Ruth and Gehrig together for like 12 years or something, or you know, even longer than that actually, all the way, well, for like 12 years together or something. And so that was the Yankees, and so every year everybody expected to see Ruth and Gehrig in the lineup together, and if you didn't have one or the other, it just wasn't the Yankees. And so so they created what was called a reserve clause, and so he applied to Congress and he got an antitrust exemption, which Major League Baseball still has today, which is ridiculous and just wrong that baseball should have an antitrust exemption, but it does. Oh well, the corporations won. So, and it was first given in the 1920s. And one of the things, because they have an antitrust exemption, they can do antitrust unfair practice things. And so one of the things that they instituted was called the Reserve Clause, which meant that if you were signed to play baseball for the Yankees, you had to play for the Yankees until the Yankees didn't want you anymore. So they could trade you or release you or something like that. Then you could go to another team. But for the most part, the Yankees owned you. Which was like, again, it's like communism, or it's like indentured servitude or slavery even in some way. And so, I mean, it's even, you know, almost akin to like kind of like slavery. And so this reserve clause existed in baseball for a long time. And you know, they're resisting the whole union push, you know. And so in 1960s, players' wages were not real high. They were making like, you know, $20,000 a year. They were, you know, making a good salary, you know, for an average person, but they weren't making millions. But the owners were. And so finally what happens is in the 1960s, unions are getting to be a really big thing. Now they're not anymore. There's been all this push, corporations won, yay! And so they've pushed back unions, and so collective bargaining is basically dead. Not entirely, but basically. And so, but in the 60s it was happening. Collective bargaining was very powerful in the 1960s. The Teamsters, Jimmy Hoffa, they were a very powerful organization. And so baseball formed a union in 1966. Very late in the game to be finally forming a union, but it was inevitable, it was going to happen, and eventually in the 1960s the time was right to finally have a union in baseball. Okay, so now, yay, players finally have a union, and initially, you know, salaries raised a little bit because the owners realized that they were going to have to raise salaries. But what happened was, in 1969, a fellow by the name of Curt Flood, who was a superstar outfielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, and the Cardinals had won the World Series as recent as 1968, was traded by the Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies, who were a bad team. And it wasn't that Curt Flood did not like Philadelphia. He did not want to play for a loser team. He wanted to stay with Lou Brock and Bob Gibson and stay on the winning team. So they traded him to a loser team. And he said, I don't want to go. And so he challenged the reserve clause. And eventually, even though his career was ruined, eventually he won. So the unions had a big fight against ownership, and the first strike, people don't know, was actually 1972. But we only missed about 2 weeks of games, and then they had kind of a condensed schedule, so we really only lost like 5 games in 1972, even though they were on strike for like 2 weeks. But there was actually a strike in 1972, and it was over this reserve clause. And the union basically won. And that was the beginning of free agency. And so now instead of the team, and so when the team owned you, they could control your salaries and make sure that nobody made, let's say, more than $100,000. Now that you have the reserve clause abolished, and now you have free agency after a certain period of time, and Andy Messersmith became the very first free agent, he now could ask for whatever he could get. So, hey, I'm available. I'm a 20-game winning pitcher. Hey, don't you want me leading your staff? Well, yes, we do. Well, you're going to have to pay up. And so he became the first free agent, and it wasn't long before Reggie Jackson, for example, got the first $1 million contract. And that changed the whole landscape even of baseball. My grandfather was very good friends with Jerry Hoffberger and the people that owned the Baltimore Orioles in the 1960s and 70s. And in fact, my grandfather was very much responsible for the Orioles coming to Baltimore. He was one of the initial investors in the team. And one of the initial, what you call, boosters, I guess you call them. And he was personal friends with Hoffberger. And Hoffberger, he relays a story that Hoffberger told him. He's like, look, I don't doubt that Reggie's worth $1 million a year. You know, I mean, he's a great player. You know, there's no doubt. I'm sure he's going to be in the Hall of Fame. But, and this was in 1976, when Reggie was traded to the Orioles. And but he says, but I can't pay it. $1 million a year. What that does to my overall payroll and my overall numbers, I can't afford it. I can't even do it. I can't even give him $1 million a year, even if I wanted to. So he sold the team eventually to a new group of investors. Edward Bennett Williams. In the 1980s, you've got the movers and the shakers, and you've got the corporate raiders, and you got billionaires now, and it's a whole new world. And baseball became a whole new world, kind of as salaries increased. And we're kind of getting to that point again, you know. And we're getting some pushback. Cable is failing. It's not competing very well with streaming, but then not everybody is streaming either. So it's going to be a little bit of a ceiling now. But anyway, so that started free agency, and so when Shohei Ohtani became a free agent, he was able to say to the league, look, I'm available. Don't you want Babe Ruth on your team? And teens were like, oh, yeah, we do. You're going to have to pay. And so it wasn't Ohtani that was saying you have to pay as much as it was. Other teams were saying, hey, we'll give 600. Oh, we'll give 620. Oh, we'll give 650. We'll give 675. Oh, finally, the Dodgers said, we'll give 700. And now the other teams was like, oh, I'm out. Because apparently there were offers of like in the 600s. The Dodgers just offered the most money at the end of the day. And that's why they got them. Okay, so the last thing I would like to talk about is production. So this goes back to like Ayn Rand. All right, the world is different now than it was even 30 years ago. And so when Ayn Rand says, the problem with, and this goes back to communism, the problem with communism is that communism asks for people who produce more to share with everybody. And that's not fair, because people who produce more are worth more. That's basically Ayn Rand's concepts. And these are basically the central concepts for basically the whole Republican Party and why they don't want to pay taxes. But that was fine as long as you produce things. But now, let me give me your iPhone. Now we have these things. Isn't that fancy? Wow, look at that. Isn't that cool? Okay, now we have these things. These things have changed the world. And now there's a lot of products that we used to produce that we don't produce anymore. And I'll cover that in a future lesson. But, or else they're significantly reduced as far as how much we use it. And like magazines, for example. We still make them, but not nearly as much. And so the world is different now. And so when you talk about production, we don't need production. We don't need to produce food. That isn't the issue. We don't need to produce even things. We don't need to produce clothing. We don't need to produce shoes. We don't need to produce chairs and lamps and things like that. Now you have companies like Facebook, for example. What do they produce? They don't produce anything. And actually, just going onto the Facebook's website, logging onto Facebook, is adding to the GDP. And you post something, you're actually creating the content. You're actually the one producing it. They're making the money. Why are they worth $860 billion? Almost $1 trillion. Why? Why is it worth so much money? What do they produce? They've got like 5 guys in a room that decide to change an algorithm or a program once in a while, and that's it. That's all they have to have. That's the way the world is now. Not everything, just like not everything before was dedicated to food production, now not everything is dedicated toward production. Whether it's shoes or textiles or food or whatever it is, cars or whatever we need, our economy no longer is dedicated to production. That's an antiquated idea. So all of Ayn Rand's ideas, old world, not today's world. So that's where I wanted to end up. And so that concludes this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like or share or even subscribe. Tune in for the next episode on Learning with Power. I'm Scott Powers Houston. You have a great day. Take care.